Good morning and welcome to Rising. Thank you for tuning in. We've got a great show prepared for you today. It's very nice to see you, Jessica Burbank, joining me remotely. Thanks for filling in.
It's good to be here. It's always a special treat when we get to host together, Robbie.
Yes, very much indeed. We can't wait to get you back in D.C. sometime soon to host in person. So we will get started with our show now. We're continuing to report on the aftermath of the collapse of the Francis Scott Key Bridge, of course, since the devastating collision of a cargo ship into the bridge on Tuesday, shortly after 1 a.m. Now, 2 bodies have, in fact, been pulled out of the freezing water. They were workers repairing potholes on the Key Bridge when it collapsed. 4 of the workers are still missing and presumed dead. 2 other workers did survive the collapse. Those 8 workers were the only people, in fact, on the bridge at the time of the destruction, thanks to the quick work of authorities who were able to stop cars from driving onto the bridge after they'd received an emergency call from the pilots who had lost control of the ship. Now, reports say lethal materials may have leaked and that the economic and emotional cost to Baltimore is, in fact, mounting.
Meanwhile, misinformation about what caused the tragedy is circulating, with some insisting that the collapse was not an accident. Representative Nancy Mace said this Tuesday on Newsmax.
Look at the $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill that was done a couple of years ago that the left hails as this massive success, but it was mostly Green New Deal actually in that bill.
Representative Jeff Van Drew went a step further, bashing Pete Buttigieg and telling Fox Business News, quote, he's worrying too much about pronouns, worried too much about DEI policies. And Anthony Sabatini, a Florida congressional candidate, also blamed DEI for the bridge collapse on X. Meanwhile, Baltimore Mayor Brandon Scott responded to right-wing critics who called him a DEI mayor. Let's watch that.
Black men and young black men in particular have been the boogeyman for those who are racist and think that only straight, wealthy white men should have a say in anything. We've been the boogeyman from them since the first day they brought us to this country. And what they mean by DEI, in my opinion, is duly elected incumbent. We know what they want to say, but they don't have the courage to say the N-word.
So let's
Robbie,
talk
what do you
about
make of this?
let's talk about that part first. I saw there's a lot of discussion about DEI mayor, et cetera. So there were some right-wing accounts on social media accusing that figure, Scott, who's the mayor of Baltimore, of being a DEI mayor when he made his remarks on the tragedy. Obviously, that's kind of, so I do think DEI has a pernicious aspect to it, and I'm very suspicious of hiring or doing admissions based on race or some factor of that like that. But the mayor is an elected position. He wasn't appointed to his job or picked because of some consideration I don't think should have been a consideration. He was elected. He won the election. So he's, like, by definition, not a DEI hire. And I think that's a pretty important point. One that I actually did see now a lot of conservatives making, including Christopher Rufo, Christina Pashaw, who is the advisor to Governor DeSantis, both saying that he's definitionally not a DEI hire, and that we should, people who are critical of DEI, including myself, ought to be, careful about expanding it to just encompass, like, literally everything that they don't like or have a problem with.
Yeah, it's also, he got 70% of the vote, 70.49% of the vote in that general election in Baltimore in 2020. That's a significant majority. Obviously, this is not a position that is appointed by a committee or a board who's considering diversity, equity, and inclusion. This is the people of Baltimore voting for who they want to be their mayor. Nancy Mace's comment about the infrastructure spending is a bit ridiculous. We've had a lot of Republicans say, look at all of this money, Marjorie Taylor Greene included, people like Lauren Boebert, that I've gotten for our district, federal funds coming in because of me. When they voted against the infrastructure bill, we obviously need to rebuild America's crumbling infrastructure. Obviously, this wasn't even precisely one of the problems with infrastructure that we see. A huge cargo ship carrying 95,000 tons crashed into it. That's what caused it to collapse. And so to point to that spending bill and say, oh, well, it's the Green New Deal. What does that mean? Why would the Green New Deal cause a bridge to collapse? Yeah. It's just the dots are connecting there, and connecting every major tragedy in industry to diversity, equity, and inclusion has been kind of a common theme. We saw this happen right after the Silicon Valley banking collapse. We saw this after Norfolk Southern. We're seeing it again now. And if DEI was an acronym instead that stood for deregulation in every industry, it would fit quite well, because Silicon Valley's banking collapse came after they took away the Dodd-Frank regulations that would cause a bank of Silicon Valley Bank size to stress test for potential conditions where there were high interest rates, which is what Silicon Valley Bank credited for their collapse. If we look at Norfolk Southern, we have Deb Fisher out of Nebraska chairing the Senate Committee on Surface Transportation. Her top 4 donors are rail industries. Her number 1 donor is Union Pacific. This is someone with a conflict of interest. We saw major railroad deregulation that allowed for a train to be traveling at the speed it was and the unsafe conditions it was that affected Norfolk Southern, that caused the crash derailment in East Palestine, Ohio. And everyone that's in these surrounding communities, whether it's in Maryland or Norfolk Southern or someone who is banking with Silicon Valley Bank, they're affected by this as well. It's not just the workers and the people that were driving on the bridge or in the surrounding neighborhood directly of the derailment. It's everyone in the community for miles and miles that's affected by this deregulation. And to point to DEI as in diversity, equity, and inclusion is just really dishonest.
Yeah, I mean, frankly, look, a giant ship slammed into the bridge. There's no, it didn't have anything to do with DEI that we know of so far. It doesn't. More infrastructure spending, less infrastructure spending was not going to make a difference. No bridge on Earth would have withstood that kind of collision. So it could be the case that the ship itself should have been inspected more cautiously, or the fact that there were some red flags raised during previous inspections. And now I think it had passed its most recent one in New York, but in the past issues had been raised with it. So that could end up being an issue, and we're going to have to have response. If there is a responsible party, somebody should be held accountable. President Biden obviously has said the federal government's going to pay to rebuild the harbor. I'm like, does the shipbuilder not repay for it? If there was an error with the ship, why do the taxpayers have to take that on? So I think there's still a lot of questions to answer there. I like deregulation, unlike you, Jessica. Obviously, still things need to be safe and inspected, and when people cause harm, those people need to be held accountable, like in this case. But there is a desire, I think, on both sides of the political spectrum to just blame their usual hobby horses, like whatever you're obsessed with is, it must be this, including the people kind of critiquing DEI. Obviously in his remarks on MSNBC there, the mayor was basically just saying, people, when they say DEI, actually mean the N-word, that it's just a way of, is calling somebody a racial slur, which I don't think is the case. I think there is a correct and thoughtful criticism of DEI, but you'll open yourself up to understandable accusations that you're just being racist if you describe literally everything as DEI, or there's just a black man on television, you're like, oh, he's DEI. I see how that would be pretty insulting.
Yeah, really just shoving a puzzle piece where it doesn't fit with that response. I think some of the folks who have driven ships in and out of harbors before are now writing articles about what they think might have happened. I read an article by someone who used to pilot freight ships like this, if you can call them that. I don't know what they're called in the industry, cargo ships probably. And he said that there's a few things that he would like to see folks look at. He said, this ship with a questionable engineering state, obviously they lost power, they lost propulsion, that can cause a crash. But there's also concerns around potentially using dirty fuel that needs to be looked into now, and other engineering difficulties, that perhaps the ship wasn't kept up to snuff so that the crew was safe on it, and obviously the people driving on the bridge that day. And this is an example of where deregulation gets in the realm of making people unsafe, whether they're workers in the industry, consumers of the industry, or just people in the surrounding area, because using dirty fuel is absolutely a way these companies can cut costs. You have all kinds of deregulation happening that jeopardizes safety, but it saves input costs for a lot of these very large corporations, which spend a lot of money lobbying Congress, and Congress making a decision to jeopardize the public safety in an industry where they're taking a ton of money from is just obvious corruption. And it's happening all across our government, and we've seen the effects of it to an extreme extent in the past year, whether we want to look at this crash into the Maryland Bridge, if we want to look at Norfolk Southern and East Palestine, Ohio, or if we want to look at the banking collapses that we saw. All of these we can tie to regulations that were in place and were overturned in an effort for deregulation that went too far and jeopardized people's safety.
All right, well, we will continue to follow this story, and we'll have more Rising right after this.